My hands did not shake when my sister-in-law stood in the middle of our anniversary party and shouted, "She is a cheater!" The room believed a glowing phone screen faster than the woman who kept this family from collapsing for 2 years. What nobody knew was that I had been waiting for this exact moment. I was not going to defend myself. I was going to make everyone realize they had chosen the wrong side. My name is Brinley Perry. I am 34 years old, and if my career has taught me anything, it is that the most dangerous traps are never hidden in the shadows. They are written in plain sight, buried in the fine print, waiting for you to be too comfortable to read them. I work as the Director of Contract Compliance at Stonewaite Contract Group. My entire professional life is built on anticipating failure, finding the loopholes before they can be exploited, and understanding exactly how people try to cheat each other. Living in Savannah, Georgia, with my husband, Nolan Perry, I have had to apply those same professional skills to my own family. Tonight is our 9th wedding anniversary. For most couples, the 9th is a quiet dinner, perhaps a nice bottle of wine at home, a stepping stone to the milestone of the 10th. But the Perry family does not do quiet, and they certainly do not miss an opportunity to put on a performance. We are hosting the celebration at the Magnolia Ledger House. It is a breathtaking riverfront event venue, the crown jewel in the portfolio of South Lantern Hospitality, the Perry family's multi-million-dollar business. Years ago, this building was an abandoned warehouse. Now, it boasts exposed, century-old brick walls, towering arched windows that overlook the dark water of the Savannah River, and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over the wealthy elite of the city. The atmosphere in the room is meticulously curated to project effortless prosperity. A live band plays soft, slow jazz in the corner, the velvety notes of a saxophone blending with the ambient hum of polite conversation. Waiters in crisp uniforms weave silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The air smells of expensive perfume, roasted herbs, and the faint, sweet humidity of the southern river just outside the glass doors. Our guest list is a strategic blend of personal affection and corporate necessity. There are our closest friends and immediate relatives, of course, but more importantly, the room is heavily peppered with long-term vendors, local politicians, and a very specific group of banking executives. These bankers are currently holding the keys to a massive refinancing project that the Perry family desperately needs to finalize by Monday morning. The refinancing will keep South Lantern Hospitality from drowning under the weight of its own mismanaged debts. This party is not just a celebration of my marriage to Nolan. It is a live demonstration of stability. It is a show meant to assure the bank that the family is unified, solvent, and trustworthy. Standing near the center of the room, dressed in a sleek, emerald green silk gown, I am the living embodiment of that requested stability. I am polite, refined, and entirely in control. Over the past 2 years, I have become the quiet anchor of this family. When South Lantern Hospitality was bleeding money due to a series of disastrous financial missteps and chaotic vendor agreements, I stepped in. I spent countless hours combing through their chaotic ledgers. I renegotiated terrible contracts, fired predatory suppliers, and personally structured the compliance protocols that kept the company out of bankruptcy court. I saved them. The older generation of the family, particularly Nolan's parents, has come to rely on me. They trust me. They look at me with a profound, if somewhat reluctant, gratitude. But not everyone in the room views my competence as a gift. Through the golden haze of the chandeliers and the moving bodies of the guests, I catch her eye, Celeste Perry. She is my sister-in-law, married to Nolan's older brother, Beckett. Celeste is standing near a towering floral arrangement of white orchids, holding a glass of sparkling water, entirely motionless. She is watching me. Celeste is not the kind of woman who makes a scene. She does not yell. She does not throw tantrums, and she never allows her makeup to run. She fights with a terrifying kind of grace. She strikes people with a politeness that is as sharp as broken glass. She is the master of the slight smile that does not quite reach her eyes, The backhanded compliment that leaves you feeling cold and small. The gentle suggestion that completely undermines your authority. Before I stepped in to fix the company, Celeste was the undisputed queen of the Perry family's social and domestic empire. She curated the image, she controlled the narrative, and she basked in the approval of her in-laws. My arrival, and my subsequent rescue of their legacy, stripped her of that unique status. I did not just save the business, I proved that her husband, Beckett, was the one who nearly destroyed it with his reckless spending. She has never forgiven me for making her look like the wife of a failure. Usually, Celeste masks her disdain with a flurry of overly sweet conversations and fake enthusiasm. But tonight, she is doing none of that. She is simply watching me, her expression completely serene, her posture relaxed. She looks almost peaceful. That is what makes my blood run cold. I have survived in the corporate world, and in this family, long enough to know how to read the silence. When a predator stops pacing and goes completely still, it is not because they have lost interest. It is because they have finally cornered their prey. Celeste is too quiet. She is holding something. I can feel it in the air. A subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. My husband's hand settles warmly on the bare skin of my lower back, pulling me out of my intense observation. Nolan leans down, his breath brushing against my ear, smelling faintly of bourbon and mint. "You are a million miles away," Nolan murmurs, his tone gentle and laced with concern. "Are you okay? Bryn, you look incredibly tense." I force my shoulders to drop, painting a reassuring smile on my face as I turn to look at him. Nolan is a good man, handsome and endlessly optimistic. He loves his family blindly, which is exactly why I have to be the one who sees clearly. "I am perfectly fine," I say, keeping my voice light and steady. "I am just tired. Nolan, coordinating the caterers, the florists, and the seating chart took a lot out of me this week. I just need a minute to breathe." "You did an amazing job," he replies, kissing my forehead. "The venue looks flawless. The bankers are very impressed. You saved us again." "Bryn, go mingle with the loan officers," I tell him softly, patting his chest. "Make sure they keep drinking." Nolan chuckles and walks away, completely unaware of the invisible currents swirling around us. I watch him go, feeling a sharp pang of guilt for lying to him. I am not tired from the event planning. I am exhausted from waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I cannot ruin our 9th anniversary and jeopardize this crucial night over a baseless intuition. I cannot walk up to my husband and tell him his sister-in-law is planning something sinister just because she is standing too quietly near the flowers. In my line of work, you do not make an accusation without a paper trail. I take a slow sip of my wine, trying to wash away the dry anxiety coating my throat. I tell myself I'm being paranoid. I tell myself to enjoy the jazz, the success, the beautiful evening I built with my own 2 hands. But then I look back across the room. Celeste is no longer standing alone. She has moved closer to the bar. She is now standing in a tight circle with 2 of Nolan's oldest aunts and, most alarmingly, the lead underwriter from the bank. Celeste is leaning in, her head tilted, whispering something with an expression of deep, mournful concern. The 2 aunts gasp softly, their hands flying to their chests. The banker's face hardens into a mask of sudden, cold professional alarm. And then, as if choreographed by an unseen director, all 4 of them stop speaking. Slowly, simultaneously, they turn their heads and look directly across the crowded room. They look straight at me. The jazz band continues to play. The laughter of the other guests continues to echo off the old brick walls. But I do not hear any of it. The temperature in my veins turns to ice. There is a signal moving through this room. A deadly frequency being broadcasted right beneath the surface of the champagne and the smiles. Everyone is starting to hear the music change. I am the only one who does not yet know the words to the song. I was not born into rooms with vaulted ceilings, jazz bands, and endless flutes of vintage champagne. I grew up in a modest, working-class neighborhood in Middle Georgia, where money was a finite, heavily guarded resource. In my childhood home, a leaked roof meant my father was picking up an extra shift at the plant, and a broken vehicle transmission was a full-blown crisis that required a tense family meeting at the kitchen table. That kind of upbringing wires your brain differently from the start. You learn to read household budgets before you learn to read novels. You know the exact price of a gallon of milk, the precise cost of a kilowatt of electricity, and the specific, chilling tone of voice a debt collector uses over the phone. You learn to scan a lease or a contract for the trapdoor. And more importantly, you learn to read people. You develop an almost instinctual caution, a relentless radar for who is reliable and who is merely selling you a dream they cannot afford to finance. Nolan fell in love with me precisely because I possessed that grounding gravity. He was drawn to my directness from our very first date. I made things solid. I made things clear. I did not care for unnecessary embellishments. And I never sugarcoated a hard truth just to keep the peace. This was entirely foreign to him. The Perry family operated on a completely different frequency. They were accustomed to living on appearances, relying heavily on family prestige, and making aggressive handshake agreements based on the dangerous philosophy of simply figuring the details out later. They lived in a world of soft promises and hard debts. Nolan wanted an anchor, someone who would not drift away when the financial winds changed direction. He found that in me, and he clung to my pragmatism like a man who knew his own family was building castles on sand. But that same anchor is exactly what made Celeste despise me from the very beginning. When I first entered the Perry family orbit nearly a decade ago, I did not react the way she expected a newcomer to react. I was not easily dazzled. When she paraded her seasonal designer wardrobes, or casually dropped the names of state senators and local elites she had shared cocktails with over the weekend, I merely nodded politely. I did not ask for introductions. I did not fawn over her curated aesthetic, or ask for the name of her interior decorator. To a woman whose entire currency is social envy, a woman who cannot be impressed is a profound insult. I distinctly remember a summer afternoon several years ago, sitting on the sprawling veranda of the Main family estate. Celeste was pouring iced tea from a crystal pitcher, her posture flawlessly straight, an absolute picture of generational Southern aristocracy. She handed me a cold glass, offering a smile that felt exactly like a draft of freezing winter air. "You know, Brinley," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I think I finally understand why Nolan is so taken with you. You are just so exceptionally good at making men believe you are more stable than all the other women in the room. It is a very unique survival skill." It sounded like a compliment, wrapped in a neat velvet ribbon, but it was actually a remarkably thin blade aimed right at my ribs. She was implying that my competence was nothing more than a manipulation, a cheap trick I played to secure my position in a wealthy family. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I just drank my tea, acknowledging the silent declaration of war she had just whispered into the humid afternoon air. The friction between us escalated from a quiet, background hum to a grinding roar over the last 2 years. South Lantern Hospitality hit a massive, terrifying wall. The family had embarked on an ambitious, sprawling series of property renovations, and the costs spiraled wildly out of control within months. Supplier agreements were a tangled mess of verbal promises, undocumented scope changes, and overlapping invoices. At the dead center of this financial bleed was her husband, Beckett. Beckett is the kind of man who wears a custom suit perfectly, charms a crowded boardroom effortlessly, but possesses absolutely zero financial discipline. He operates entirely on misplaced optimism and a desperate need to prove his worth. He is always chasing ghost investments. He is the type of man who will leverage a successful, stable restaurant to buy a failing boutique hotel, promising his parents that a fresh coat of paint and just one more quarter of aggressive marketing will turn it into a goldmine. He treats the family business like a personal casino, convinced that the next roll of the dice will magically cover all his previous catastrophic losses. When a minor payment dispute with a major construction vendor threatened to mutate into a devastating lawsuit, a lawsuit that could have easily triggered a default on their existing bank loans, the family completely panicked. Nolan, exhausted and terrified, asked for my help. I stepped in, brought my professional ruthlessness to their mahogany dining room table, and began the brutal process of untangling Beckett's mess. I organized the scattered, incoherent files. I sat across from angry, aggressive contractors and renegotiated the terms dollar by painstaking dollar. I established strict payment protocols, slashed unnecessary luxury expenditures, and dragged the company back from the edge of a sheer cliff. I spent countless hours auditing ledgers that Beckett had treated like scrap paper. My success inevitably altered the gravitational pull of the entire family. My in-laws, who had once viewed me simply as Nolan's quiet, plain wife, began to look at me with genuine respect and a desperate kind of relief. They started asking for my opinion before signing anything. They brought me into confidential meetings. They began to trust my judgment over the judgment of their own eldest son, and with every single ounce of trust I gained, Celeste lost a vital piece of her territory. For years, she had comfortably occupied the role of the woman who understood the inner workings of the Perry family best. She was the gatekeeper, the closest confidant to her mother-in-law, the undisputed matriarch-in-waiting who knew exactly what everyone wanted to hear. I did not just usurp her position. I exposed the incredibly uncomfortable truth that her husband's undeniable charm was actively bankrupting them, while my working-class pragmatism was the only thing keeping their lights on. I took away her crown and replaced it with an Excel spreadsheet. I realized, as I watched her tightly controlled expressions during our recent tense family dinners, that her animosity was no longer just the petty, standard jealousy of a sister-in-law. It had mutated into something deeply structural and incredibly dangerous. I was a massive blockade in her carefully constructed world. Celeste manipulated the family's image to cover for Beckett's inadequacies and to relentlessly elevate her own status. I was the one person in her orbit who demanded receipts, who checked the math, who flatly refused to participate in the collective delusion that everything was perfectly fine. She could not manipulate me, and she found that she could no longer manipulate my in-laws as easily with me standing in the room, asking the hard questions. A woman like Celeste does not just get angry, throw a fit, and move on. She calculates, she plans, she waits for the absolute optimal moment to strike, ensuring the collateral damage is absolute and irreversible. The cold realization settled deep in my bones over the past few months, solidifying into an undeniable fact. If she ever decided to make a move against me, it would not be a spontaneous outburst fueled by temporary frustration or a bad mood. It would be a public execution. It would be the devastating final act of a silent, meticulous vendetta she had been nursing in the dark for a very, very long time. Exactly 7 days before the anniversary party, the first thread unraveled. It was a Tuesday afternoon, right around 3 o'clock. I was sitting at my desk at Stonewaite Contract Group, reviewing a dense, 50-page stack of indemnity clauses for a new supplier, when my personal phone vibrated against the wood surface. A sterile, automated security alert flashed across the screen. It was a notification from my private cloud storage account, warning me of a new, unrecognized login. I frowned, minimizing my work documents and pulling up the security details on my monitor. The IP address did not ping to a random server in a foreign country. It pinged directly to the local network of the main administrative offices of South Lantern Hospitality. It was not my phone, and it was certainly not my work laptop. My pulse did not spike immediately. In my line of work, minor digital anomalies happen all the time. Passwords get auto-saved on shared networks, and devices sync across platforms unexpectedly. But I had never logged into my personal drive on the family office computers. There was absolutely no reason for my credentials to be active in that building. Before I could navigate to the settings to remotely force a logout, a second notification slid down the right corner of my screen. It was an email preview. The sender was a luxury boutique hotel located in downtown Charleston, confirming a reservation for 2 nights under my exact legal name. I tapped the notification to open the full message. The application loaded for a split second, showing a glimpse of a confirmation number and a check-in date. And then the inbox refreshed aggressively. The email vanished. It did not go to the trash folder. It did not move to the spam filter. It was permanently deleted by whoever was currently mirroring my session. You do not spend your entire adult life tracking down fraudulent shell companies and buried financial liabilities without developing a visceral, physical reaction to vanishing data. A deleted email is never just a clumsy mistake. It is an intentional action. Someone was currently inside my account, and they were actively curating what I could and could not see. More importantly, they were establishing a digital footprint. A romantic hotel room booked in Charleston. A login originating from the family office network. They were not blindly digging around looking for my personal secrets. They were methodically planting their own. My immediate, overwhelming instinct was to pick up the phone and call my husband. I stared at Nolan's contact name on my screen for a long, agonizing minute. But Nolan was already carrying an unbearable, crushing weight on his shoulders. The massive refinancing deal for the family business was scheduled to close at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. He was sleeping maybe 3 or 4 hours a night, endlessly pacing our living room floor in the dark, constantly rehearsing his talking points for the bank executives. If I called him right now and told him someone in his family was digitally stalking me and fabricating secret hotel reservations, he would completely detonate. He would storm into the corporate office, demand answers, and shatter the fragile peace. And the person doing this would simply deny it, wipe the hard drive, and smoothly make me look like a paranoid, deeply stressed woman trying to manufacture petty family drama right before the most critical financial moment of his entire life. I needed an airtight case before I said a single word. I did not go to my husband. Instead, I went to Avery Sloan. Avery and I had shared a tiny, incredibly cramped apartment during our sophomore year of college. Today, she operates as an independent digital forensics contractor who spends her days dismantling corporate espionage cases and tracking stolen cryptocurrency assets across global servers. I called her on an encrypted line and immediately gave her temporary administrative access to my compromised accounts. I asked her to pull the raw server logs, isolate the intrusion, and analyze the hidden metadata of the permanently deleted messages. While Avery dug into the invisible architecture of the security breach, I did exactly what I do best. I followed the paper trail. I logged into the secure financial portal for the Magnolia Ledger House. If someone was trying to set me up, I was looking for a distraction. I needed a reason why someone would suddenly require me to be thoroughly discredited and pushed out of the picture. I found that reason buried deep inside the third quarter marketing ledger. There were 3 massive invoices approved and paid out in rapid succession. The total amount was staggering, coming out to exactly $240,000. They were vaguely coded as comprehensive brand consultation fees for a vendor I had never once seen before. The company was called Harbor Ember Studio. In the rigid world of corporate contract compliance, speed is always the ultimate, undeniable red flag. These 3 massive invoices had entirely bypassed the standard 30-day operational review period. They were authorized, processed, and fully funded within 48 hours of their initial submission. There were no attached deliverables, no milestone progression reports, and no authorized signatures from the creative directors. It was just a clean, blindingly swift transfer of a massive sum of cash out of a company that was currently begging a bank for a lifeline. The very next afternoon, I found myself standing in the gleaming, brightly lit conference room at the family office. Celeste was there, carefully arranging a set of highly expensive catering menus for an upcoming charity gala she was chairing. I walked over to the long mahogany table, holding a printed copy of the venue budget file, making sure to keep my face perfectly neutral and unbothered. "Celeste," I said, keeping my tone exceptionally light and conversational. "I was running the preliminary budget for the final quarter this morning, and I noticed some incredibly heavy expenditures under a vendor named Harbor Ember Studio. Do you happen to know what specific deliverables they are providing for the venue? Celeste did not miss a single solitary beat. She did not look surprised, and she certainly did not look caught. She slowly placed a linen menu down on the table, turning to offer me that signature, glassy smile of hers. "Oh, them," she said smoothly, her voice an octave higher than normal. "They are an incredibly exclusive creative team. We brought them on specifically to target the high net worth, luxury demographic. They are doing some highly specialized, top-tier brand repositioning for us. It is all very avant-garde and experiential. You probably would not see their physical work on the standard balance sheets just yet." It was a flawless, terrifying answer. It was entirely too flawless. It was a heavily rehearsed, perfectly delivered sequence of corporate buzzwords designed to sound incredibly impressive while simultaneously meaning absolutely nothing. An invisible agency operating solely for a luxury demographic. I thanked her politely, turned around, and walked straight out of the building to my car. As soon as I closed the heavy door of my sedan and isolated myself from the noise of the street, my phone rang loudly. It was Avery. Her voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of her usual sharp, sarcastic energy. "I have the server logs. Brinley," Avery said immediately. "The specific device that accessed your cloud drive is a stationary desktop computer. It is hardwired directly into the local area network at the South Lantern Hospitality main office. But honestly, that is not the part you need to be worried about." "Tell me exactly what I need to be worried about," I replied, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel tightly. "I managed to pull the cached data fragments from that active session," Avery continued, her breath heavy into the receiver. "Whoever was sitting at that terminal was not just idly browsing your files. They were running a secondary background application while they were logged in as you. It is a commercially available message simulator. It is the exact kind of software amateur blackmailers use to generate completely fake text message threads. They input your personal phone number. They input another random number. And the program spits out a pixel-perfect, high-resolution screenshot of a highly incriminating conversation that never actually took place." I stared blankly out through the windshield at the gray asphalt of the parking lot, the phantom hotel reservation in Charleston, the simulated text messages, the massive, bleeding invoices rushing out to a ghost company. The chaotic pieces suddenly snapped together in my mind with a sickening, almost audible click. "They are manufacturing a digital paper trail," I said softly to the empty car. "Yes," Avery replied, her tone turning incredibly grim and final. "Brinley, you need to be extremely careful right now. This person does not just want to look into your accounts. They are building a narrative." The most natural human instinct when you realize you are being hunted is to turn around and scream. You want to confront the predator, demand answers, and shatter the heavy tension. I did none of those things. I chose absolute, suffocating silence. If you confront a liar when you only have suspicions, they will simply deny everything, burn the remaining evidence, and retreat into the shadows to plan a quieter attack. But if you let a liar believe they are winning, if you let them think they have completely outsmarted you, they become remarkably careless. They step out into the light. I decided to let the trap grow. I was walking on incredibly thin ice, but I made sure my breathing was perfectly controlled. 2 days after my phone call with Avery, I drove to the Magnolia Ledger House long after the catering staff had gone home. The venue was dark, silent, and entirely empty. I used my master keycard to access the basement server room. The air conditioning hummed loudly as I connected an encrypted external drive to the central security mainframe. I did not just want to know what was happening in the digital cloud. I needed to know what was happening in the physical space where my anniversary party would take place. I systematically downloaded every single hour of interior surveillance footage from the past 2 weeks. I pulled the specific digital logs for the main ballroom audio and visual system. If someone intended to make a public spectacle, they would need the projector screens. I wanted the digital fingerprint of every single laptop or flash drive that had been plugged into that podium over the last 14 days. Finally, I exported the master scheduling software, looking for any calendar appointments that had been quietly altered or erased by the administrative staff. The next morning, Avery called me back with the forensic analysis of the simulated text messages. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of my office. "They made a massive structural mistake, Brinley," Avery said. "Whoever generated these fake screenshots did not understand how digital metadata actually works. If you are having a secret, illicit romance, those text messages accumulate naturally over a period of months. You send a message on a Tuesday morning, another on a Friday night. But the embedded creation data on these image files tells a completely different story. Every single screenshot was generated, cropped, and saved in 2 massive batches on a single Thursday afternoon. They manufactured an entire 6-month relationship in exactly 45 minutes. They were in a hurry," I replied, staring out my office window. "They were sloppy," Avery corrected. "But they have enough to convince a room full of people who do not know how to read a file directory." I needed to understand the specific narrative they were trying to build. I went back to the fragmented, partially deleted email Avery had managed to salvage from the breach. Most of the text was corrupted, but one single name survived the deletion process: Evan Rowe. Seeing his name printed on the screen made the temperature in my office plummet. Evan Rowe was not a random stranger. He was a senior escrow specialist working directly for the financial institution handling our massive refinancing package. He was the man responsible for verifying that the Perry family had legitimate, tangible collateral before the bank released the funds. A terrifying clarity washed over me as I remembered a business trip I took to Charleston exactly 3 weeks prior. Evan had reached out to me through a highly secure, independent channel. He was terrified. He explicitly asked to meet me in person, completely off the official record, far away from the Savannah corporate offices. We met in the crowded, dimly lit lobby of a luxury boutique hotel in downtown Charleston. I remember the exact way Evan's hands were shaking as he held his coffee cup. He leaned across the small marble table and whispered that the marketing disbursements did not match the physical construction progress. He warned me that someone inside South Lantern Hospitality was aggressively trying to push a falsified compliance packet through the bank's approval process before the final deadline. He did not know who it was, but he knew the math was fundamentally broken. We spoke for exactly 20 minutes before we went our separate ways. I closed my eyes, picturing that hotel lobby, the large glass windows, the open sightlines. Someone had followed me to Charleston. Someone had been sitting in that lobby, holding a camera with a telephoto lens. They had photographed me sitting intimately across a small table from the exact man who held the keys to the family loan. They were not just going to accuse me of having an affair. They were going to accuse me of sleeping with the banker. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the plan finally crystallized in my mind. This elaborate smear campaign was never really about a jealous sister-in-law wanting to ruin my marriage. The fake affair was nothing more than a spectacular, blinding distraction. It was a preemptive strike. Celeste knew I was digging into the fraudulent marketing invoices. She knew I was getting dangerously close to uncovering the missing funds. She needed to completely annihilate my credibility before I could step into a boardroom and expose the financial rot. If I walked into the refinancing meeting on Monday morning and declared that the family was committing fraud, the bank would immediately freeze the assets. But if I was publicly exposed as a bitter, cheating wife who was actively sleeping with one of the bank's own employees, everything would change. Any accusation of fraud I made would instantly be dismissed as the vindictive, desperate lies of a woman trying to destroy her husband's family to save her own reputation. My professional integrity would be reduced to ash. The timing of the trap was the most chilling detail of all. The anniversary party. She was not just going to tell my husband. She was going to drop the bomb in a room filled with the exact banking executives who needed to sign the loan documents on Monday. If she humiliated me at the party, I would lose my voice completely. I would be silenced right before the most critical financial transaction in the history of the company. I picked up my phone and dialed Avery's secure number. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. "Avery," I said the moment she answered the line. "Do not block the intrusion. Take down the firewalls on the cloud drive. Let them have unrestricted access to the fake files." "Brinley, are you completely out of your mind?" Avery asked, her voice rising in genuine panic. "If you let them finalize this package, they are going to execute you in front of your entire family." "I am not going to stop her," I said smoothly, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet office. "If I confront her privately, she will just find another way to bury the truth. I want her to feel victorious. I want her to choose the exact night. I want her to pick the exact room. I want her to ensure every single important person is standing there watching." I paused, looking down at the encrypted flash drive resting on my desk. "I want her to build the stage," I told Avery, "because once she steps onto it and hands everyone the microphone, there will be absolutely no way for her to walk back down." The evening flowed toward its inevitable focal point. At exactly 9 o'clock, the catering director gave a subtle hand signal to the waitstaff. The jazz band smoothly transitioned into a slow, melodic ballad, the notes drifting lazily above the crowd. The ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed slightly, focusing a warm, golden spotlight on the center of the dance floor where a massive, three-tier vanilla cake sat on a polished silver pedestal. Waiters glided silently through the crowd, pouring the final round of vintage champagne into crystal flutes for the customary toast. The low murmur of 150 guests softened into an expectant hush as Nolan stepped up to the microphone positioned right next to the dessert table. He looked incredibly handsome, flushed with the warmth of the evening and the alcohol. He picked up his champagne flute and tapped the side of the glass with a silver spoon. The gentle, bright chiming sound echoed off the exposed brick walls, drawing every single eye in the room directly to us. I stood beside him, my posture perfectly straight, wearing my emerald gown and playing the role of the devoted, successful wife to absolute perfection. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight," Nolan began, his voice carrying a genuine, heavy emotional weight that made the microphone hum slightly. 9 years ago, I made the absolute best decision of my entire life. These past 2 years have tested our family and our business in ways we never anticipated. But through every late night, every stressful meeting, and every single moment of profound doubt, Brinley was my rock. She is the reason we are all standing in this beautiful venue tonight. She is the reason our foundation is stronger than ever. So please, raise your glasses to my incredible wife, to 9 years of marriage, and to a lifetime more. The room erupted in polite, affectionate applause. Glasses clinked together in the golden light. I smiled genuinely, reaching out to rest my hand affectionately on his arm. Nolan picked up the heavy silver cake knife, his large hand covering mine as we prepared to make the ceremonial first cut into the pristine white icing. "Stop." The word was not shouted, but it was delivered with a sharp, piercing clarity that sliced entirely through the soft jazz and the lingering applause. The band leader hesitated, his fingers faltering clumsily on the piano keys. The music died instantly. The sudden silence in the massive, vaulted ballroom was absolute and suffocating. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head, my hand still resting lightly on the silver handle of the knife. Celeste Perry stood directly in the center of the room. She had moved away from her previous, quiet position near the floral arrangements and was now commanding the absolute center of the floor. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her chin held high. She held her smartphone tightly in her right hand. Beside her, Beckett sat frozen in a velvet armchair. He did not look up at his wife. He did not reach out a hand to stop her. He stared fixedly at the polished wooden floorboards, his shoulders tense, looking exactly like a man bracing for a car crash he had helped engineer but was entirely too cowardly to watch happen. "Nolan," Celeste said, her voice echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet room, "before you cut that cake, And before you spend another minute pretending you have a perfect marriage, there is a truth you desperately need to know. A collective gasp rippled rapidly through the audience. I watched the faces of the guests shift violently from pleasant intoxication to raw, undeniable shock. Nolan blinked hard, dropping his hand from the knife. He looked at his sister-in-law with utter confusion, his brow furrowing deeply as he stepped slightly in front of me. "Celeste, what are you doing?" Nolan asked, his tone laced with nervous disbelief and a hint of warning. "This is absolutely not the time." "There is never a good time for this," Celeste replied, her voice dripping with an artificial, sickeningly sweet sorrow. "But I cannot stand here and watch you celebrate a massive lie. I cannot let you toast to a woman who has been systematically betraying you for months. Brinley is not your rock, Nolan. She has been having an extramarital affair, and the man she is sleeping with has been actively helping her prepare an exit strategy from this family and this company." The silence that followed her declaration was so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Nobody in the room dared to breathe. With a swift, practiced motion, Celeste tapped the screen of her phone. She had already synced her device to the venue's master digital projection system. The enormous high-definition screen mounted on the exposed brick wall directly behind us, normally used for corporate presentations, flared brilliantly to life. The entire room was instantly bathed in the harsh, blue light of the digital display. The first image was a massive, blown-up screenshot of a text message conversation. The messages were explicit, romantic, and heavily detailed, plotting secret afternoon meetings and discussing how tired the sender was of her current husband. The contact name at the very top of the screen clearly read my first and last name. Before the crowd could fully process the text messages, Celeste swiped her finger. The next image appeared. It was a crisp, high-resolution photograph of me walking into the opulent lobby of a boutique hotel in Charleston, and walking right beside me, leaning in close with his hand hovering near my shoulder, was Evan Rowe. I immediately shifted my gaze to the left side of the room. The lead underwriter from the bank, the man who held absolute power over our refinancing deal, physically recoiled. His eyes darted rapidly from the screen to me, then right back to the screen. He recognized Evan immediately. Evan was his own employee. The banker took a slow, deliberate step backward, physically distancing himself from the Perry family as if our sudden moral corruption was a highly contagious disease. A massive financial conflict of interest had just exploded directly in his face. Celeste swiped one final time. A hotel booking confirmation filled the entire screen. 2 nights in a luxury suite in Charleston. The reservation was clearly printed under my exact legal name. The whispers began. They started as a low, frantic hissing sound at the far edges of the room and rapidly infected the entire crowd. It was the sound of 100 people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing a spectacular, devastating scandal. I looked at my mother-in-law. All the color had drained completely from her face, leaving her skin ash-white. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, swaying slightly on her feet as her husband grabbed her arm to steady her from falling over. I turned my head to look at Nolan. If he had exploded into a violent rage, if he had screamed or thrown his champagne glass against the brick wall, it would have been so much easier to witness. But he did none of those things. He stood entirely paralyzed. The warm, deeply loving expression he had worn just 2 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, devastating emptiness. He looked up at the massive screen, and then he looked down at me. His eyes were wide and bright with a sudden, unspeakable pain. He looked exactly like a man who had just felt the solid ground beneath his feet turn into empty air. His complete silence was the most agonizing sound in the entire building. "I am so incredibly sorry, Nolan," Celeste said, placing her manicured hand over her heart, playing the role of the reluctant, heartbroken messenger with terrifying accuracy. "I tried to keep this quiet. I tried to handle this privately. But when I saw you standing up there, thanking her for her loyalty, I realized I could not let you continue to be played for a fool on your own anniversary. You deserve to know who you are actually married to. Every single pair of eyes in the Magnolia Ledger house locked onto me. The air was incredibly thick with judgment and condemnation. They were waiting for the inevitable, messy collapse. They fully expected me to burst into hysterical tears, to stammer out a frantic denial, or to rush aggressively across the floor and desperately try to rip the phone out of Celeste's hand. They wanted the dramatic reaction of a guilty woman caught in the glaring, unforgiving spotlight. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I let go of the silver cake knife and let my hands fall relaxed and open at my sides. I slowly turned my body away from my husband and faced the massive digital screen. I took my time, studying the fabricated text messages, the perfectly framed photograph of Evan, and the fraudulent hotel receipt. I analyzed the digital forgery with the cold, entirely detached interest of a professional auditing a remarkably clumsy financial ledger. Then, I turned my head and looked directly across the room at Celeste. She was staring back at me, her chin raised, waiting to see terror register in my eyes. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not say a single defensive word. I simply looked at her, and I smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was a calm, relaxed, and entirely serene expression. It was the smile of a woman who had just watched her enemy walk exactly into the center of a steel trap and firmly lock the door from the inside. The frantic whispers in the room suddenly died down. The atmosphere shifted violently from scandalized excitement to a deep, creeping unease. I watched the triumphant, glowing pride on Celeste's face flicker and slightly dim. She had expected me to shatter into a million pieces. Instead, she saw a woman who was perfectly comfortable standing in the absolute center of the wreckage. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably on their feet, exchanging highly nervous glances. They did not understand why I was smiling. They did not understand why I was not afraid. But as I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to completely dismantle the entire Perry family illusion piece by piece, I knew every single person in that room was about to find out. "Thank you, Celeste," I said. My voice was entirely level, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of the hysterical pitch every single person in the room was holding their breath to hear. The words echoed clearly through the silent ballroom, bouncing off the exposed brick and the high vaulted ceilings. "Thank you for choosing tonight to put everything on the table once and for all." The atmosphere in the room violently shifted gears. The collective anticipation of a messy, tearful breakdown evaporated, replaced by a dense, confusing chill. It was the exact tone I used when opening a highly contentious vendor negotiation. It was polite, it was professional, and it was entirely ruthless. Celeste blinked, her carefully rehearsed expression of tragic sorrow faltering for a fraction of a second. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for tears. She had absolutely no defense against corporate courtesy. I took a slow step away from the cake table and gestured toward the massive digital display illuminating the wall behind me. "However," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my sister-in-law, "if we are going to do this publicly, we need to do it correctly. You are currently running a compressed, prearranged slideshow. If you are going to accuse me of destroying my marriage in front of our entire family, our closest friends, and the financial underwriters holding the future of South Lantern hospitality in their hands, we should not rely on a curated presentation. I want you to mirror your actual phone screen to the venue system. Pull up your live photo gallery. Let everyone in this room see the raw files." Celeste froze. It was a microscopic hesitation, a tiny rigidness in her shoulders that lasted for no more than a single heartbeat. But I saw it. I knew she would never back down. Her entire social identity was built on never losing face. In her mind, the larger the projection, the more devastating my humiliation would be. Her supreme confidence in her own fabrication pushed her right over the edge. "Fine," Celeste snapped, her voice regaining its sharp edge. "If you want to drag this out, be my guest." She tapped her screen a few times, switching the input from the presentation application to her live device feed. the massive screen flickered, revealing the grid of her personal photo gallery. Before she aggressively tapped on the folder containing the screenshots, the giant text messages reappeared, glaringly bright against the dim lighting of the party. "Let us start with the basic timeline," I said, walking closer to the screen and turning my back to Celeste. I addressed the crowd exactly as I would address a room full of auditors. Take a close look at the message thread supposedly sent on October 14th. The first message from my number is time-stamped at 2:15 in the afternoon. Now, look at the immediate reply, allegedly sent just 10 minutes later. I raised my hand, pointing directly at the glowing blue bubbles towering above me. "The formatting is fundamentally broken," I stated clearly. The first timestamp uses a standard 12-hour clock with the AM and PM markers. The second timestamp, in the very same continuous thread, suddenly switches to a 24-hour military format. Furthermore, look at the text alignment. The font weight on the morning messages is standard, but the afternoon messages use a slightly compressed letter spacing. The gray hex code of the chat bubbles is literally 2 different shades. This does not look like a continuous conversation on a single smartphone. It looks exactly like 2 separate graphical interfaces stitched together by someone who did not double-check their output settings. A low murmur rippled through the audience. A few of the younger guests, people who practically lived on their phones, began to squint at the screen, nodding slowly as they noticed the glaring visual discrepancies I was pointing out. The lead underwriter from the bank narrowed his eyes, his posture stiffening. He was a man who spent his life looking for inconsistencies in loan documents. He knew what a doctored file looked like. "That is ridiculous," Celeste interrupted loudly, taking a step forward. Her tone was defensive, sharp and slightly rushed. "It is just a cloud syncing error. Phones do that all the time when the operating system updates, or when you lose cellular connection." She swiped her screen aggressively, banishing the text messages and pulling up the high-resolution photograph of Evan Rowe and me. "You can argue about font sizes all night to save face," Celeste sneered, turning to face Nolan. "But you cannot argue with this. A syncing error did not put your wife in the lobby of a luxury hotel in Charleston with another man." The room fell dead silent once again. The text messages were technical, easy to debate, but a photograph was visceral. It was right there in front of them. The visual evidence of me standing intimately close to another man anchored the lie right back into reality. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the way Evan was leaning toward me, the worried tension in his shoulders that the camera angle perfectly framed to look like romantic secrecy. I turned away from the screen and looked directly at my husband. Nolan was staring at me, his chest rising and falling heavily. He was desperately waiting for me to scream that it was a Photoshop job, to claim that I had never been there. "That is me," I said quietly. A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked the oxygen right out of the room. My mother-in-law let out a tiny, wounded whimper. "That is me," I repeated, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "And that is Evan Rowe. We were in the lobby of that hotel." I offered absolutely no further explanation. I did not say why we were there. I did not mention the escrow accounts. I simply confessed to the location and the company, leaving the damning image hanging heavy in the air. It was a calculated, brutal risk, by admitting to the photograph without defending the context. I sounded exactly like a woman who had just been cornered by the undeniable truth and had no more lies left to tell. The fragile doubt I had just planted regarding the text messages vanished instantly. The crowd aggressively tilted back toward Celeste. The whispers turned harsh and judgmental. I could practically feel the hatred radiating from the Perry family side of the room. Nolan closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the profound sadness had hardened into something cold and brittle. He was finally breaking, sensing the absolute shift in the room's energy. Celeste moved in for the final. Lethal strike. She was not going to give me another second to speak. "I did not want to play this," Celeste said, her voice dropping to a theatrical, mournful whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "But you leave me no choice. Brinley, You refuse to just admit what you have done. She tapped her screen one final time. A stark black audio interface appeared on the massive display. She pressed the play icon. The audio file was slightly grainy, carrying a hollow echo, as if it had been recorded in a large, empty space or secretly captured through a thin wall. But the voice was unmistakable. It was my voice. The specific cadence, the slight southern drawl on the vowels, the deliberate pacing of the words. It was a perfect match. I cannot wait any longer. My voice echoed through the venue, sounding urgent and frustrated. We just need to push this through. I am so incredibly tired of waiting for them to figure it out. We have to do this now. The recording stopped, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. The audio clip was incredibly ambiguous, completely stripped of any identifying context, but placed immediately after a fabricated romantic text thread and a secret hotel photograph. It became the final nail in the coffin. It sounded exactly like a woman desperately rushing her lover to finalize their escape plan. It sounded like a woman entirely finished with her current life. I looked at Celeste. She was standing tall, her shoulders relaxed, breathing easily. The momentary panic she had shown during the text message analysis was completely gone. She had played her masterstroke, and she knew it had landed perfectly. The crowd was no longer just suspicious. They were convinced. They were looking at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The trap had fully closed. Celeste had successfully woven a few digital lies and a stolen audio fragment into a seamless, devastating narrative to every single person standing in the Magnolia Ledger house. I was no longer the savior of their business. I was a traitor. I was standing alone in the wreckage, surrounded by 100 people who were entirely ready to watch me burn, and the woman who struck the match was smiling right at me. "I need exactly 5 minutes of your time," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom. I did not wait for anyone to grant me permission or for the shocked murmurs to fully subside. I stepped away from the ceremonial cake, leaving my husband standing frozen in the center of the polished floor, and walked directly toward the main audio-visual control podium positioned at the edge of the stage. I reached behind the sleek metal stand, disconnected the wireless casting receiver that was mirroring Celeste's smartphone, and plugged in the encrypted flash drive I had brought with me. "You have presented a very compelling, highly emotional story tonight, Celeste," I said, my fingers flying across the venue's touchscreen panel. "But as anyone in corporate compliance will tell you, a story is completely worthless without verifiable data. So, let us look at the actual data." The massive digital display behind me flickered black for a split second before roaring back to life. Celeste's fabricated screenshots vanished, entirely replaced by a stark, heavily detailed spreadsheet. It was my official corporate itinerary for the week of the Charleston trip. "Let us start with the photograph," I continued, pacing slowly back toward the center of the room so I could look directly into the eyes of the banking executives. I am not going to deny being in that hotel lobby, because I was exactly there, on Tuesday, the 14th of October, at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a heavily populated public space, filled with tourists and businessmen. That is not where you go to hide a romantic affair. That is where you go when you need a neutral, public ground to discuss something incredibly dangerous. I tapped a button on the remote in my hand. The itinerary minimized, and a pre-recorded video file expanded to fill the screen. It was a high-definition video call I had recorded just 24 hours prior. The face of Evan Rowe, the senior escrow specialist from the bank, appeared in massive proportions, looking entirely grave and professional in a dark suit. The lead underwriter standing in the crowd immediately stiffened, his jaw dropping slightly as he recognized his own subordinate projected on the wall. "Play," I commanded. Evan's voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers of the venue. "My name is Evan Rowe. I am a senior escrow officer handling the South Lantern Hospitality refinancing package. On the 14th of October, I urgently requested a secure, off-the-record meeting with Brinley Perry in Charleston. I asked to meet in a public hotel lobby because I was extremely concerned about internal surveillance at the Perry family offices. During that brief meeting, I explicitly warned Brinley about 3 massive marketing disbursements, totaling $240,000. That had been rushed through the approval process without any matching deliverables. I suspected a severe discrepancy in the draw schedule, and I needed her to investigate the matter privately before the bank finalized the Monday morning closing. The video ended, freezing on Evan's intensely serious expression. The physical reaction in the room was instantaneous and violent. The collective gasp was louder this time. The narrative had just violently shifted from a sordid, petty marital betrayal to a massive corporate financial crisis. The lead underwriter from the bank took a sharp step forward, his eyes darting frantically toward Beckett and then toward Nolan. He was no longer looking at a family drama. He was looking at a potential federal fraud investigation involving his own institution. Celeste's posture remained rigid, but the victorious, glowing flush had completely drained from her cheeks. She was incredibly smart, but she had fundamentally miscalculated my preparation. She thought I would be paralyzed by the humiliation of the photograph. She never imagined I would weaponize the man in the picture against her. "A business meeting," Celeste said, forcing a harsh, dismissive laugh that sounded completely hollow. She took a step toward me, trying to reclaim the physical space I had just taken back. "How incredibly convenient, Brinley. You managed to find an auditor who was willing to cover for you, but a meeting about vendor payments does not explain the text messages. It certainly does not explain a 6-month romantic history on your phone, and it does not explain that audio recording of you begging to run away. Those things do not just magically appear out of thin air." "You are absolutely right," I replied smoothly, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "They do not appear out of thin air. They are manufactured." I clicked the remote again. The video of Evan disappeared, replaced by a highly complex, technical diagnostic readout provided by Avery Sloan. The screen was filled with lines of digital code, hexadecimal strings, and brightly highlighted extraction dates. I had a certified digital forensics expert pull the hidden metadata from the email packet containing your so-called evidence, I explained, gesturing toward the highlighted red boxes on the screen. "When you send a text message, the operating system logs the exact second it was created. If I was having a 6-month affair, those creation dates would be spread out over 180 days. But as you can clearly see right here on the screen, every single one of those text message screenshots was generated, cropped, and saved on a single Thursday afternoon within a 45-minute window." I paused, letting the silence hang heavily over the crowd so the sheer weight of the technical truth could settle in. "Furthermore," I continued, pointing to a specific line of code, "the digital signature on these image files does not match an Apple or Android operating system. It matches a commercially available software application designed specifically to generate fake chat interfaces. The conversation you just forced this entire room to read never happened. It was typed out on a keyboard by someone desperate to create a distraction." A low, dangerous murmur ripped through the crowd. The guests were sitting up straighter, their eyes wide, completely captivated by the brutal, systematic dismantling of the lie. The bank representative crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face hardening into a mask of pure, professional fury. The word fraud was practically flashing in neon letters above his head. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a deliberate, calculated attempt to fabricate evidence to derail an internal financial audit. Celeste was rapidly losing the room, and she knew it. The technical data was suffocating her narrative. Like a cornered animal, she immediately abandoned the logical argument and aggressively pivoted back to the emotional weak point. She weaponized the one thing I could not easily defend with a spreadsheet. "If this was just a noble investigation to save the company," Celeste demanded, her voice rising to a frantic, sharp pitch, "then why all the secrecy? Brinley, why were you sneaking around in Charleston hotels behind your own family's back? Why were you pulling surveillance data and hiring forensic hackers instead of just talking to your husband? If you are so completely innocent, why did Nolan have absolutely no idea what you were doing?" The question hit its exact intended target. I slowly turned my head to look at Nolan. The absolute devastation in his eyes had transformed into something else. It was a deep, agonizing confusion mixed with a profound sense of betrayal. He was no longer looking at me as a cheating wife, but as a stranger. He was a man who believed our marriage was an absolute partnership, a team that faced every single crisis together. Hearing that I had been secretly investigating his family, meeting with bankers in the shadows, and compiling a massive forensic dossier without ever breathing a single word to him broke something fundamental inside his chest. The pain radiating from him was raw and incredibly real. I felt a sharp, heavy ache in my own throat, but I forced myself to swallow it down. I could not afford to be soft right now. "Nolan," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, speaking directly to him and ignoring the 100 people watching us. "I wanted to tell you. Every single night this week. I wanted to tell you." "Then why didn't you?" Nolan asked, his voice cracking slightly, the sound of it echoing painfully in the quiet ballroom. I pulled my gaze away from my husband and turned slowly, deliberately, until I was looking directly at Celeste. I let the silence stretch for 5 long seconds, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on my next breath. "Because," I said, my voice ringing out with a cold, absolute clarity that commanded total silence. "Because the person I suspected of stealing that money is standing right here in this family, and I knew that if I did not have absolute, irrefutable proof before I opened my mouth, you would all call me a liar." I did not give the room a single second to recover from the shock of the fabricated digital evidence. The false narrative of my infidelity was already bleeding out on the polished wooden floor, but I was not interested in simply clearing my name. I wanted to expose the rotting foundation of the entire house. I turned my back to the stunned crowd, reached out to the control panel of the audio-visual system, and tapped the keyboard. The massive digital display behind me shifted instantly. The forensic code analysis vanished, replaced by a stark, incredibly dense financial spreadsheet. It was the master payment reconciliation ledger for the Magnolia Ledger House, a document only high-level executives and bank auditors were ever supposed to see. Against the elegant backdrop of the exposed brick wall and the romantic, ambient lighting of an anniversary party, the cold rows of financial data looked like a loaded weapon. "Let us move past the amateur digital forgery and look at the actual motive," I announced, my voice steady and commanding, projecting clearly over the terrified whispers of the guests. "Look at the 3 lines highlighted in yellow at the top of the screen. These are 3 separate, expedited invoices paid out to a vendor named Harbor Ember Studio. The total sum of these disbursements is exactly $240,000. I turned my head and locked eyes with Celeste. She was standing frozen, her perfectly manicured hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. "Celeste," I continued, adopting the exact tone of a relentless corporate auditor. "Just last month, during a formal family dinner, you proudly bragged that Harbor Ember Studio was handling a booming high-end brand campaign for the venue. You told your in-laws that they were an exclusive creative team redefining our luxury demographic. You justified the massive expense by claiming their work was revolutionary." I raised my hand and gestured broadly toward the spreadsheet on the wall. "In the world of corporate finance, we operate on a very simple rule. If a company pays a massive sum of money for a service, there must be a tangible product. I spent the last 72 hours auditing the entire marketing department of South Lantern Hospitality. There are no creative briefs. There are no preliminary design sketches. There are absolutely no completion reports, and there is not a single piece of authorized acceptance documentation. There is no brand campaign. There is absolutely nothing but $240,000 leaving our operating accounts and vanishing completely into the dark." The lead underwriter from the bank stepped even closer to the front, his eyes darting frantically across the numbers on the screen. He was silently doing the math in his head, calculating the catastrophic impact this missing capital would have on the loan-to-value ratio of the entire company portfolio. "I decided to look a little closer at this revolutionary creative team," I said, clicking a button on my remote. The spreadsheet minimized, and a certified document from the State Business Registry filled the screen. Harbor Ember Studio does not operate as a legitimate advertising agency, I explained, the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. They do not have a public portfolio. They do not have a creative director. They do not even possess a functional commercial telephone number. It is a registered shell company. And if you look closely at the physical address listed on their official articles of incorporation, you will find it incredibly revealing. I clicked the remote one more time. A photograph of a weed-infested, abandoned commercial lot appeared next to the registry document. The registered headquarters for this luxury marketing firm is an empty dirt lot, I stated coldly. It is the exact same address as the failed boutique condominium project that Beckett secretly tried to develop 3 years ago. The project that went bankrupt and left him drowning in personal debt. The invisible spotlight in the room instantly snapped away from me and hit Beckett with the force of a physical blow. He could not hide in the velvet armchair anymore. He sprang to his feet. His face flushed a deep, panicked red. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he aggressively adjusted the collar of his expensive custom suit. "This is completely insane," Beckett shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he pointed a shaking finger at me. That was a temporary investment structure. It was an internal bridge capital arrangement designed to optimize our end-of-year tax liabilities. You have absolutely no idea what you are looking at. You are deliberately twisting a standard corporate financial maneuver to smear your own brother-in-law just to save your own reputation. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic screaming. I simply stood my ground, exuding the calm, terrifying patience of someone who had already won the war. A standard corporate financial maneuver requires standard administrative authorizations. Beckett, I replied, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. I pressed the button on the remote. The screen shifted again, displaying the highly secure digital signature page attached to the 3 massive cash transfers. To bypass the mandatory 30-day holding period for an invoice of this size, company protocol requires 2 separate executive signatures, I explained to the crowd, pointing the laser at the bottom of the document. One signature belongs to the chief financial officer. The second signature on this approval form belongs to my husband, Nolan. I turned my body to face Nolan directly. He was staring at the digital projection of his own signature, his eyes wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension. Look at the digital timestamp embedded next to your electronic signature. Nolan, I said gently, though the words were utterly devastating. It shows that you authorized this massive transfer of funds on the 2nd of September at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Do you remember exactly where you were at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 2nd of September? Nolan swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his face. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. I was on a commercial flight to Chicago, Nolan whispered. The room was so quiet that his broken, quiet voice carried to the very back walls. Exactly, I confirmed, turning my attention back to the captivated audience. You were 30,000 feet in the air on a domestic flight that did not offer any wireless internet access. You were completely disconnected from the corporate server. You could not have possibly reviewed or authorized that transfer. Someone sitting inside the family office used your terminal, forged your digital credentials, and pushed the stolen money out the door while they knew you were completely unreachable. The sheer, undeniable reality of the crime finally crashed down upon the older generation of the Perry family. Nolan's mother let out a sharp, agonizing gasp that sounded like she was physically suffocating. Her legs gave out completely beneath her elegant evening gown. She collapsed heavily into the nearest chair, pressing both of her trembling hands tightly over her mouth. She was no longer watching a petty domestic dispute or a scandal about a cheating daughter-in-law. She was staring directly at the terrifying, looming shadow of federal fraud charges, corporate embezzlement, and the absolute destruction of the family wealth. Realizing that the sophisticated, polite facade was completely shattered and that the technical evidence was burying her husband alive, Celeste completely lost her mind. She dropped the elegant mask of the heartbroken sister entirely. Her face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. "You arrogant, manipulative bitch," Celeste hissed, stepping aggressively into my personal space, her voice vibrating with a raw, ugly hatred. "You have been incredibly jealous of my position in this family since the very first day you walked through our doors. You hate the fact that you are just a working-class accountant trying to play dress-up in our world. You manufactured this entire financial audit. You manipulated the ledgers because you want to seize total control of South Lantern Hospitality. You are trying to push my husband out so you can steal the entire company for yourself." Before I could even open my mouth to respond to her frantic, desperate screaming, a new voice violently hijacked the room. "Enough!" It was the lead underwriter from the bank. He pushed his way aggressively through the crowd of stunned relatives, his face flushed with a terrifying professional outrage. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from Beckett, pointing a rigid finger directly at the older brother's chest. "I need to see every single original vendor file associated with this venue immediately," the banker demanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "If there is even a fraction of a percent of truth to what she is saying. If you are actively using forged electronic executive signatures to divert our collateral funds into private shell corporations, our entire lending agreement is void. If those 3 invoices are fraudulent, I am suspending the Monday morning refinancing package right now. I will have our legal department lock down your operating accounts before midnight." Complete and utter panic erupted in the Magnolia Ledger house. Several relatives started shouting at the same time. The members of the jazz band were quietly and rapidly packing their expensive instruments into their cases, desperate to escape the blast radius of the collapsing empire. I stood perfectly still in the dead center of the swirling chaos, watching the Perry family tear itself apart. I had not even delivered the final, fatal blow yet. I looked directly at Celeste. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the fire she started to burn me had just engulfed her own house. "Money does not just disappear on its own, Celeste," I said quietly, making absolutely sure she could hear my voice over the screaming room. "And digital evidence does not just magically sprout out of thin air to frame an innocent woman. The person who spent 45 minutes staging a fake affair did it because they knew they were about to be caught. They built the lie because their hands were already covered in the stolen money." The sheer volume of the room was deafening. The lead underwriter was still shouting at Beckett, demanding an immediate freeze on all corporate accounts. My mother-in-law was weeping openly into her hands, the sound a ragged, awful keening. In the middle of this total collapse, Nolan reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was not violent, but it was desperate. He pulled me away from the center of the floor, dragging me toward the towering, arched windows overlooking the dark water of the Savannah River. We were isolated enough to speak without being overheard by the screaming bankers, but we were still entirely visible to every single person in the room. "Brinley," Nolan began, his voice a frantic, ragged whisper. He looked physically ill. The charming, confident man who had toasted our marriage just 20 minutes ago was completely gone. "You have to stop this. Please. You are destroying everything." "I am not the one who stole $250,000, I replied, keeping my voice terrifyingly flat. "And I am not the one who hired someone to forge a digital history of a fake romance." "I did not know about the fake affair," Nolan pleaded, stepping closer to me, his eyes wide and begging. "I swear to God, Brinley, I had absolutely no idea what Celeste was planning tonight. If I had known, I would have stopped her. But the money..." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I knew about the money. The air in my lungs completely froze. I stared at the man I had loved for 9 years, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to clarify his words. But he just kept looking at me with that agonizing mixture of guilt and terror. "You knew," I repeated softly. It was not a question. "I found out 3 weeks ago," Nolan confessed, the words rushing out of him like blood from a wound. Beckett came to me in tears. He told me his side real estate deal was completely underwater and that he had diverted some of the venue capital to keep his creditors from seizing his personal assets. He was terrified of going to federal prison. He was terrified of what it would do to my parents. I told him he had to put every single cent back before the Monday morning refinancing deadline. I gave him a window to fix his own mess. I was completely stunned. My mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. I had spent the last 2 years bracing myself against the toxic behavior of his family. But I always believed Nolan was standing right beside me. I realized in that exact moment that I had not been betrayed in some dramatic, cinematic fashion. I had been betrayed in the most common, deeply painful way imaginable. My fundamentally good husband had chosen to delay a hard truth because he was too much of a coward to watch his family shatter. You knew your brother was committing major financial fraud, and you said absolutely nothing to me, I stated, my voice devoid of all warmth. You let me spend my nights agonizing over those ledgers. You let me walk into a meeting with a bank executive who was ready to pull our funding. You let your sister-in-law build an execution pyre for me, all because you wanted to give your brother a few extra days to hide his crimes. I was protecting you, Nolan insisted, reaching out to touch my face. I stepped back sharply, refusing to let him make physical contact. I did not want you to carry the legal liability of knowing about a stolen disbursement. I thought I had the situation entirely under control. I was going to force him to repay it this weekend. A short, bitter laugh escaped my throat. It was a dry, hollow sound that offered absolutely no comfort. I thought I had it under control, I echoed, shaking my head. That is the exact sentence women always hear right before the entire ceiling collapses on top of them. While Nolan and I stood by the windows, a fresh wave of noise erupted from the center of the ballroom. Celeste was not going quietly, like a cornered predator. She realized that if she could not win the factual argument, she had to win the emotional one. She had climbed onto the small wooden stage where the jazz band had been playing, raising her voice over the panicked arguments of her relatives. Do not let her twist this," Celeste shouted, pointing a manicured finger across the room at me. Yes, Beckett made a terrible, desperate business mistake. He misallocated funds to save a failing project. But that is exactly what it was, a mistake, an internal family issue. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her evening bag and held it up like a battle flag. Brinley is using a simple accounting error to execute a hostile takeover, Celeste proclaimed to the wavering crowd. I found this in the corporate printer tray last week. It is a draft of the revised corporate bylaws. She was quietly drafting a legal amendment to grant herself co-approval rights on every single vendor contract over $50,000. She wants to sideline my husband. She wants to castrate Nolan's authority. She is a cold, calculating woman who built this entire spectacle to steal the family legacy. And she is using Beckett's mistake to distract you from the fact that she is actively sleeping with the man from the bank. I watched the Perry family relatives exchange highly uncertain glances. The lead underwriter from the bank had already stepped out of the room to make a frantic phone call, leaving the family alone with the scandal. And in his absence, the old loyalties began to reassert themselves. To these people, a woman who cried, begged, and threw a tantrum was understandable. But a woman who stood perfectly still in a designer gown, methodically destroying her attackers with spreadsheets and forensic data, was terrifying. I was too smart, too prepared, and too calm, and because I was not performing the expected role of the hysterical victim. They were incredibly eager to believe I was the villain. They wanted to believe that my competence was actually just ruthless ambition. Nolan looked back and forth between me and his screaming sister-in-law. He looked entirely lost. A man paralyzed by his own indecision. He wanted to defend me, but he also wanted to protect his brother from the police. His silence was the final, fatal crack in the foundation of our marriage. Right at that exact second, my phone vibrated sharply against my hip. I did not break eye contact with Nolan as I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out the device. It was a secure text message from Avery. The message read, "The final extraction from the venue server is complete." I accessed the backup drive for the main projector system. I have the entire device log from the rehearsal on Thursday night, and I recovered a deleted audio file. They recorded themselves. I read the words twice, letting the reality of what Avery had found wash over me. The pain of Nolan's cowardly confession was still burning a hole in my chest. It was a deep, agonizing wound that I knew would probably never fully heal. But as I looked at my husband, and then looked across the room at the woman who had tried to publicly destroy me, that pain began to crystallize. It hardened into something as sharp and unyielding as glass. I had spent my entire adult life making things safe for this family. I had fixed their mistakes, balanced their budgets, and protected their fragile reputations. And in return, they had constructed a labyrinth of lies and expected me to politely suffocate inside of it. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I did not say another word to Nolan. I simply turned my back on him and began walking slowly toward the center of the room. I was no longer interested in saving anyone's face. I was no longer interested in protecting the Perry family legacy. I walked right back into the spotlight, perfectly calm, entirely ready to burn the rest of the house straight to the ground. "I need everyone to be absolutely quiet for one last minute," I said. My voice was not a shout, but the absolute, freezing authority behind the words made the remaining chaotic murmurs in the ballroom die instantly. I did not look at my husband, and I did not look at the weeping mother-in-law. I walked with deliberate, measured steps back to the audiovisual control podium. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the secure connection cable I had brought with me, and plugged my smartphone directly into the venue's massive projection system, bypassing Celeste's device entirely. "You see, Celeste, you made one critical, unforgivable error when you planned this elaborate execution," I said, my fingers flying across the digital console to access the restricted administrative network. "You forgot that the Magnolia Ledger House is not just a pretty room for weddings. It is a state-of-the-art corporate facility. The smart screens in this building do not just blindly display what you cast to them. They cache the data. And more importantly, they record ambient diagnostic audio to optimize the microphone equalizers during event rehearsals." The massive screen behind me flashed a brilliant, blinding white for a fraction of a second. Then, a highly detailed system log from Thursday evening, exactly 2 days prior to our anniversary party, filled the display. "This is the internal backup log pulled directly from the exact screen behind me," I explained, pointing a heavy laser pointer at the glowing green text. "It clearly shows a device registered under the name Celeste Mobile establishing a local connection at exactly 8 o'clock on Thursday night. It shows a specific folder titled Anniversary Surprise being preloaded into the system memory. And it shows the exact audio file we all just listened to." I tapped a button on the console, patching Avery through the venue's main surround sound speakers. "Avery, please explain the audio file," I instructed. Avery's voice echoed through the massive room, sounding incredibly crisp, technical, and entirely devoid of emotion. "The recording of Brinley is a deep fake. It is an artificial intelligence voice clone generated from dozens of her public speaking engagements and corporate presentations. If you run the audio file through a basic spectrogram, you can physically see the spliced frequencies on the graph. The background noise drops out clumsily between the vowels, which is a massive red flag. It is a generated fake, built using commercially available voice synthesis software." The crowd physically shifted, a collective, heavy wave of horrifying realization washing over them. People who had been glaring at me just 10 minutes ago were now staring at Celeste with wide, terrified eyes. But I was not finished. The technical explanation was merely the prologue to the final, devastating blow. "That was just the setup," I said softly into the microphone, my eyes locking onto Celeste's pale, rigid face. "Now, let us listen to the actual performance." I clicked the final, encrypted file Avery had managed to recover from the server cache. It was an ambient audio recording. It was slightly muffled and carried the distinct echo of the empty ballroom, but the voices were entirely decipherable. It was captured by the smart screen's internal diagnostic microphone on Thursday night, right when the venue was completely empty. The entire room held its collective breath as Celeste's frantic, hushed voice suddenly played through the overhead speakers. "If we do not bury Brinley right here at the party, we are completely out of time," the recorded version of Celeste hissed, her tone dripping with vicious urgency. "If we destroy her credibility on Saturday night, no one will believe a single word she says when the vendor files blow up on Monday morning. The bank will not trace where the sponsor deposits went before the refinancing closes. They will just think she is a bitter, cheating wife trying to ruin the family to save her own skin." Another voice joined the recording. It was Beckett. His tone was pitched incredibly high, vibrating with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Are you absolutely sure Nolan has not figured out the money was routed through Harbor Ember Studio to save my real estate project?" Beckett pleaded in the recording, his voice cracking with desperation. "If the bank auditors track that $240,000 back to my personal shell company, I am going to federal prison. Celeste. They will lock me away. He does not know a single thing." Celeste's recorded voice snapped back coldly, radiating a terrifying arrogance. "Just let me handle Brinley. Once she is completely out of the picture, we have the money, and we have the company. She is just collateral damage." The audio file ended abruptly. The silence that immediately followed was not just heavy, it was apocalyptic. Every single lie, every single denial, and every carefully constructed defense was instantly turned to absolute dust. There was no arguing with their own voices. There was no claiming a system error or a misunderstanding. They had stood in this exact room 48 hours ago and inadvertently recorded their own criminal confession. The lead underwriter from the bank, who had just rushed back into the ballroom from his phone call, marched straight past the frozen family members. His face was a mask of pure, unforgiving legal fury. "The refinancing process is officially suspended," the banker announced loudly, his voice slicing through the dead air like a machete. "Our legal department is locking down the entire file package related to these disputed payments tonight. We are freezing your operating accounts immediately. Expect a full forensic audit, and expect federal law enforcement at your corporate office by Monday morning." I turned slowly to look at Nolan. He was staring at his older brother and his sister-in-law as if he had never seen them before in his entire life. The grand polished illusion of his perfect family had just been violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. This time, he did not look at me with confusion, and he did not look at me with doubt. He did not try to stand in the middle and keep the fragile peace. Nolan squared his shoulders, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He walked directly over to my side, planting his feet firmly on the floor. He turned to face the entire room, his eyes locked onto Beckett. "If any of you ever speak my wife's name again, you will answer to me," Nolan said. His voice was shaking with a terrifying, deeply contained rage that commanded absolute respect. "Anyone who touched her reputation to cover up their own fraud will face the consequences alone. You are completely on your own. Beckett, I am done." Celeste made one final, desperate, pathetic attempt to survive the burning wreckage. She lunged forward, her carefully maintained elegance completely destroyed. Her face twisted in absolute ugly fury. "You destroyed this family," Celeste screamed at me, her voice ragged and hysterical, echoing wildly off the brick walls. "You ruined everything we built." But the room had completely turned against her. Even Nolan's mother, the proud matriarch who had spent decades protecting the Perry image above all else, slowly turned her back on Celeste. The older woman walked away, her head bowed in absolute, crushing shame. Beckett did not step forward to defend his wife. He simply collapsed into a velvet chair, dropping his head between his knees. He finally realized that the elaborate, cruel play they had designed to kill my credibility had just become their own collective, highly public confession to a massive financial crime. The chaos around me began to fade into a dull, distant roar. Relatives were shouting angrily at each other. The bankers were rushing toward the exit doors. and a century-old legacy was actively burning to the ground. But as I stood there, I did not feel a loud, triumphant thrill of victory. I simply felt an overwhelming, freezing cold clarity. I turned away from the glaring digital screen and walked slowly back to the center of the dance floor. I stopped right in front of the massive, untouched anniversary cake. I looked down at the pristine white icing, understanding that tonight had ended much more than a corporate financial scam. It had ended a remarkably naive marriage. It had permanently killed my blind loyalty to a family that would have gladly sacrificed me to save themselves. It had completely shattered the soft, insidious power of those who genuinely thought they could push me out of my own life with a screen full of lies. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver cake knife. I did not need to say another word as I held the polished handle, the metal cool and solid in my grip. The entire room fell silent once more. They watched me, finally understanding the absolute, undeniable truth. The quiet, reliable woman they had all been so eager to aggressively condemn just an hour ago was the only person who had been telling the truth from the very beginning. Thank you for listening to the story. Please comment below to let us know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by more people.